Good morning, Peabody friends. It's Miss Bloom here, and we've been enjoying reading some books about spring, and that made me think about our worms. Now, you might have thought I forgot our worms in the Peabody Library Discovery Center, but I didn't. I brought them home. They're here. Here's one of our bins, and I even have one right here in my hands to say hello. I brought him out, so I'm going to put him back. And we're going to read the first of a few fun books about worms. The first one is going to be mostly, let me put my little camera down here, mostly real information, so nonfiction, and then we'll get to some fun stories. This one is called We Dig Worms, which kind of means two things. One, we can dig worms out of our gardens and out of places where we're allowed to dig. But it also means we like worms or we love worms. If you say, ooh, I really dig this, that means I really like it. Our author and illustrator is Kevin McCloskey, and the publisher is Toon Books. They do books that look a little bit like cartoons or comic strips. Wow. And when you look at the inside cover, do you see some worms? Long pink worms. And look closely at this picture. We'll be talking about this. Do you see this little spot here that's a little bit different from the rest of the worm's body? That's important. That's where worms make their eggs and their egg sacs. So we'll talk about that in a moment. And here's our title page, We Dig Worms. There are many different worms. There are tree worms. There are sea worms, and there are even river worms. Wow, so many different kinds of worms. And there are even gummy worms. If you like to eat gummy worms, you can give a thumbs up. The worms in parks and gardens are called earthworms. You can see this little one is on his or her tummy taking a picture of a big earthworm. This bluebird is flying by and says, hello, little worm. And you'll see the shadow of the bird on the worm, and it says that worms feel light through their skin. They know when it gets lighter or darker. They can sense it through their skin because, as this page says, worms have no eyes and no nose. That's a funny picture. Worms do a lot of important work. This bluebird is trying to get the worm's attention, saying, I said hello, little worm, but the worm is not paying attention. Now the worm is talking to us. The worm says, I eat dead leaves and bugs. Yep, worms like dead leaves, they like bugs, they swallow dirt, and we'll talk more about what they like to eat in our worm bins. My tunnels bring air and water to the soil to help plants grow. So you can see here, worms love to go down underground and they build all of these tunnels, and that helps bring water and air into the earth, which is good for all the trees and plants that grow. When worms dig, twisting and turning, they make the earth earthier. That's so silly. They make the earth earthier. Now the worm is telling us, my poop is good for the soil. And this little girl says, ooh. But it is true. When worms poop, their poop, and you can see down here in the picture, it's called castings, and it makes the soil so fertile, and it helps it grow wonderful plants and vegetables and flowers. This boy says, worms are cool, and these kids say, maybe to you. And then this girl says, worms feel cool. They have cold blood. So when you hold a worm, which you may have done in our library, they do feel cool on your hands. Whoa. Now these 2 pages say map of the worm. And we're going to talk about the outside on this worm and the inside here. So on the outside it says worms don't have lungs. They breathe through their skin. So that's why it's important for them to be moist, because if their skin dries out, they can't breathe. Now remember that little special thing I showed you earlier? This little section that looks like a Band-Aid when you look at a worm from the outside, it's called the clitellum, and it says only grown-ups have these. This is where the eggs become cocoons. And this is the worm's head. And you'll see there's a little mouth. But you don't ever have to worry about a worm's mouth because it's so teeny, 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 weeny that they would never bother us. They are our friends. Now the inside of the worm, it says only muscles and nerves. Worms have no bones. So this is where their bottom is. These are their intestines. Here in the middle is their gizzard and crop. So they have 2 kinds of stomach. And then they have, do you see the red? They have blood vessels. You see those red lines? And they have 5 pairs of hearts. Oh my goodness. And they have a nerve cord and, of course, their brain and their mouth. Wow. So many interesting facts about worms. Oh, and up here, there's 2 more circles we almost missed. This is the cocoons. Worms are born from cocoons. And this is, oh, this is important, the setae. Setae are tiny bristles that help worms move. And they look like little hairs on their body. And those help them scrunch up and stretch out and scrunch up and move through the soil. Now this little girl says, Mr. Worm, why do you come out after the rain? Have you ever noticed that worms come out on the sidewalk after a big rain? Well, this guy says it's easier to wriggle when it's wet. Worms move and breathe better when it's wet. But Miss Bloom did a little research, and one other reason is that if the worm's tunnels fill up with water and the soil is filled with water, then they have a hard time breathing. They need both water and air. So if it gets too wet in the ground, they come up to the sidewalk to breathe. And then this girl says, excuse me, Mr. Worm, do you have a big family? Oh yes, one worm can have 100 babies. And that's the other interesting thing about worms. There are no really mummies and daddies. It takes 2 worms to make babies, but all worms have eggs and lay the eggs. Then this little girl is wondering how many worms live here. And it says millions and millions. Over 1 million worms can live in a small park. Wow, do you see all those worms? Millions, millions, millions. I see that bluebird. I think we know that birds like to eat worms. The bird is saying, yum, yum. How big is the biggest worm in the world? These boys and girls are asking. Well, let's find out. The Australian gypsland worm grows to be 10 feet long. Wow, that's as tall as an elephant. So this is what a gypsland worm would look like if it were all coiled up. If we stretch that out, it would be 10 feet long and as tall as an elephant. This bluebird is feeling hungry. Hey, little worm, I'm hungry. Would you like to have lunch with me? He's talking to this worm down on the ground. Having lunch with a worm, I think he means he wants to eat the worm for lunch. Why did the little worm go away? Was it something bluebird said. Oh, and the worm is quickly scampering down a hole into the earth. And the bluebird pokes its head in the hole and says, I want to meet you for lunch, worm. But the worm says, sorry, bluebird, I have important work to do. And it's going back to its digging and tunneling underground. And there we see all the worms busy at work with beautiful flowers growing right up above their heads, thanks to all the worm castings and all the tunnels that bring air and water into their roots. And that, my friends, let's see, is there another page? Oh, maybe tomorrow, says the bluebird. Thank you, worms, say the children who are gardening. The bluebird's going to try and eat a worm another day. And now we are at the end. Can we do our little finger, the end? See you next time. We have just read We Dig Worms.